What's happening, everybody? Welcome back to another Fall Obsession podcast episode. My name is Sam Thrash. I'm your show host over here at Fall Obsession. Our guest on the show this week is Mr. Charles Beaty, who is famously known as the Prince of Poachers. You guys may have heard him on other hunting podcasts or even had a chance to read part one of his book series, Prince of Poachers, during which he talks about and shares the experiences from the 70s, 80s, and 90s where he was a deer poacher down in South Texas, mainly on like the King and the Kennedy ranches and properties down there. Charles has probably killed more world-class whitetails than most hunters alive today can ever even think that they might kill in their lifetime. It was a different time back then. The game violations certainly weren't anything like they were right now. Doesn't make it right by any means, and I want to be very clear that through this podcast episode, we at Fall Obsession are in no way condoning poaching. Mr. Charles has a little bit different outlook on life and his previous experiences today in 2024, and we talk about that during the podcast episode. But sitting down with him and getting to hear just some of these absolutely insane stories that he has from over 20 years of poaching and evading law enforcement, game wardens, angry landowners, all this kind of stuff. You can't make this stuff up, guys, and I really hope you guys enjoy the podcast episode that's coming. Couple housekeeping items real quick before we get into it. I know that we at Fall Obsession here, we try to keep our podcast as clean as possible. We got a couple of words that slip up in this episode, so this is my parental advisement for you guys. If you have younger kids or family members that might be tuning into this episode, just giving you a heads up on that one for this episode specifically. And then if you guys are watching the podcast video on YouTube, I also just want to let y'all know that we had a couple moments during the recording session virtually here where the internet was a little bit spotty and there might be some lag in the video. So if you guys are tuning into the video version on YouTube, sorry about that. Hope you guys still enjoy this awesome episode. Before we get into it though, Hoot Camo, podcast partner. The guys down here at Hoot are amazing blue collar guys that are passionate about building a brand of high quality gear and camo that is affordable for the blue collar outdoorsman just like you and me. If you guys are shopping for a new good quality set of camouflage, then you've undoubtedly looked at prices, you've looked at the different brands, and you may even be saving your money right now just trying to have enough money to drop on a good set of gear like that. The Hoot guys are trying to break that barrier between good quality camo and an affordable price point, and I think they've successfully done it. If you go to their website, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So if you're looking for that next good quality set of camo, go check them out. They are Texas based, but don't let that fool you. Their products work everywhere. I have worn Hoot gear in the snow in Colorado this year, in the CRP fields of Colorado this year, in the tree stands in Texas this year, and it has worked in all these environments. I can't say enough about it. I actually podcasted in our last episode with one of the owners of Hoot, and he shares a lot more details about the products, about the brand, the history behind it, and everything. It's a really good episode. Go check it out. So, Hoot Camo, go check it out for some gear. And even if you're not going to order a full set of gear, if you just want to support them, pick up a hat, a shirt, or whatever the case might be, use the code FALLOBSESSION15 at checkout, and that's going to save you guys some money. So, Hoot Camo, go check them out. Ridge Rock Hunt Company is another podcast partner. Derek and Lacey over there in Mississippi, they book hunts with vetted outfitters across the country. Derek has a large network of outfits that he knows and trusts and that he sets his clients up with. So if you're looking for that next experience, go check out Ridge Rock Hunt Company. Give Derek a call. He'll work with you on all the details and find something that works for you. Last partner I got for you guys is the Outdoor Call radio app. Outdoors Dan from Respect the Game TV. He has created an app that you can download on any device and stream hunting shows and podcasts on demand on a loop every single day. You'll catch Fall Obsession podcasts playing on that loop every Monday, the same day as our new publications, as well as tons of other hunting shows that we all know and love. So go download the Outdoor Call radio app today. It is free and start streaming. You can also follow Outdoors Dan on social media. He does a couple of live shows at local Midwest radio stations every week. And even if you're not local to those stations, he streams those broadcasts on his Facebook Live. So if you're not local, you can catch him on there. So go follow Outdoors Day on social media, and download the Outdoor Call radio app. Finally, if you guys are maybe interested in promoting your own hunting and outdoor brand in this sponsor segment on our podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Go to fallobsession.com/podcast. That's where you get in touch with me and our production team. We talk details. If you're interested, fallobsession.com/podcast. All right, it is time to head over to the episode. You guys are listening to another Fall Obsession podcast episode with Charles Beaty, the Prince of Poachers.
Oh, you got her, dude. She's down. Let's go.
Dude, I just shot a deer of a lifetime.
Freaking smoked him.
One with nature, and if you're a believer, one with God.
Definitely gets your heart pumping. Boy, you are in trouble.
Fall Obsession Podcast.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Fall Obsession podcast episode. My name is Sam. I'm your show host over here, and I am joined by none other than the Prince of Poachers himself, Mr. Charles Beaty. Welcome to the Fall Obsession podcast, Charles.
Glad to be here.
Yes, sir. We're honored to have you. You have been going on a lot of podcasts in recent years, it seems like, and have some publications as well regarding your previous life, if you will, down on the King and Candy ranches and everything down there. And that's what I want to talk to you today about, sir. And a good icebreaker, a good way that I'd like to lead into it is, where did this journey all start for you?
Well, I grew up in Arlington, Texas, near the General Motors plant. And there was a lot of open fields nearby then. And, we got sneaking our shotguns out and 22s and walking around in those fields and ended up going miles out of town as we got a little older. And, it all started there in Arlington, Texas. I didn't know where I was going to go. I ended up in deep South Texas at age 19, about 6 years after I started hunting and started learning taxidermy. And the taxidermy job offer is what took me to South Texas.
Gotcha. So
with the hopes of getting to hunt the King Ranch.
Yeah. So you had hopes of hunting the King Ranch. Let's talk about that a little bit. You had a job opportunity that brought you down there to South Texas, like you said, as a taxidermist. What kind of experience did you have as a taxidermist?
Oh, I was tops on birds already, and had already learned how to mount heads and fish, and got real good at fish too. But a professor from a university in Kingsville, A&I University, came up and ran into my brother at a gas pump where he worked at a gas station, and he laughed at a pair of quail the professor had there under glass in the seat. And he goes, "What's the matter? Hadn't you ever seen any mounted quail?" And he said, "Yeah, I've seen mounted quail. My brother mounts quail, make those look like shit." And he said, "Really? Where is he?" And he told him where I worked there in Fort Worth. And he came and hunted me down, and in a week or two, he made me an offer after doing a few birds for him for a sample of my work to come down there and work and primarily just mount thousands of quail and put them in furniture and under glass and gun cabinets and desks and everything else, coffee tables. And he taught me into going by bribing me, seduced me with the possibility, probability, likelihood. He said, "I can get you connected with the King Ranch and you'll get to hunt them big deer down there." I'd never heard of the King Ranch then. But he told me, there's monsters, and held his arms out about 3 feet wide. And that did it. I was, 16, 17 years old then. He taught me into going down there.
And when was this?
I think, let's see, 76. I was actually closer to 19. I just got married, about 6 months married. I just turned 19, I think, when that professor showed up and taught me into moving to Kingsville.
Gotcha.
His name was Alan Turner. Managing marketing professor.
Gotcha. So you moved down south for the taxidermy job, and once you get down there, kind of how did things unfold, in the months and years that followed once you got down to South Texas?
Yeah, the first season, me and my buddy that I talked into going with me to skin for me, and he was learning under me. What do you call that when somebody's taking up the rear on you? But he was learning bird taxidermy from me, old Super Coop. And we took up deer leases in Dimmitt County, where the big Boone and Crockett's were immediately. They leased. We did, this hunt and that hunt. nothing was panning out, and we began to meet those outlaws. The local outlaws came in the taxidermy shop. We merged after losing the lease on the downtown location of the Professors. We joined that big major taxidermy. We met all those outlaws coming in and out of there and showing us the big deer they were killing and telling us they'd take us. We gave up on the hopes of getting invited to hunt legal, and by 1977, they talked me into jumping the fence and going in after the big deer illegal. I just gave up any hopes of getting to hunt legal and went outlaw. And once I jumped the fence, it was on. I was hooked. You couldn't, it was an addiction immediately. I couldn't wait to kill my dream buck then. I had high hopes of doing it.
So, back then, you talked about you gave up all hopes of being able to hunt legally. How difficult was it back then to get a legal hunt on a property like that, and what were the consequences for poaching?
Well, you could not get a lease on any of that King Ranch. It was invitation only. So if you didn't meet the right people and get in with Flynn, you were out to start with. And a local taxidermist lady that was doing the same thing, selling birds under glass, she was married to a game warden. And they had all the pull from the King Ranch swung over to them. They used to be with the big shop I worked for, and they quit him and joined forces with her out of, favoritism to that game warden and his wife being, taxidermists too. So they had all the pull and all the influence for invitation hunts. There was one man named Jimmy Yarborough that was an heir to the ranch and one of the Clayburgh daughter's sons. And he was taking the owner at the big taxidermy I worked at every year to kill a buck, one buck every year. But other than that, there was no, you couldn't pay. There was no amount. They weren't leasing to the public. King Ranch was private. It was totally exclusively invitation only. Gas and oil people, tycoons, cattle kings. That's who they were inviting. If you weren't affiliated with the ranch through gas and oil and all the other things, agriculture, you weren't getting to hunt. You were outlaw. That's where the term probably came from. You were outside the ring, outside the circle. So once we realized we weren't going to get invited, those outlaws talked us into going. It was pretty easy for them to talk us into doing it.
Gotcha. And I think the year that you just mentioned was 77. Correct me if I'm wrong. What was the situation as far as how tight the law enforcement and the game wardens were back in the late 70s like that?
They were there, but it was a $27.50 fine. If you got caught shooting off the road or trespassing, it wasn't going to exceed $200, no matter, had a deer and trespassing around. It was Class C misdemeanor. There was no jail time. There was no real severe fine. There was nothing really there to, dissuade you from going outlaw. Just a slap on the wrist then. But it began to escalate pretty quick, as the deer began to get that extreme value. When people started paying $3,000 to $5,000 to kill a buck, the law had to come up and back the value. So the law started being lobbied to be increased, and they were. And about 1990, they upped it to a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months in county jail. I think 6 months to 2 years in county jail and a $2,000 fine. Well, all the way to 98, they kept pushing and pushing for stiffer laws as the value kept increasing. And in 1998, when I was caught, they were heavily lobbying for severe penalties. They got it pushed through in 99 to a felony. And once it became a felony, I wouldn't have went in and did it anymore anyway. I would have quit then. I told the game wardens after they finally caught me, I said, y'all could have got me to quit a lot sooner. And they said, how's that? And I said, made the law a felony 10 years ago. I would have quit 10 years ago. It wasn't worth risking a felony to go do that, But as long as it was just a misdemeanor, I was willing to play cards, gamble.
Yeah. So what was your driving force behind your desire to do that initially at the beginning? Was it just kind of out of just spite, or just not liking the lack of opportunity you had been promised?
No, there wasn't any resentment. The first seven years of it, purely my love and addiction to rattling them big bucks up. Once I'd experienced that, it was heaven on earth. get in that heavy brush and beat the bone, and they come in from every direction. I don't know how many times I've rattled up 8 bucks in one rattle, just surround you, and they'll fight right on you if there's, large aggressive bucks. It's more addictive than any drug or sex. I'd rather deer hunt than have sex anyway, but that was just how addictive it was to see those big, beautiful non-typicals come running in. I'd never seen nothing like it. I was totally, completely hooked.
So
Now the last 9 years I went back to it there was a vengeance. There was some revenge, so to speak. And we can talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll get into that here in a second. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about that's interesting because, before we had this opportunity to podcast, I listened to some other shows. I did some research on you, sir, and because I wanted to know about you. And one thing that was intriguing to me was traditionally when folks think of a poacher, they think of somebody just shooting over fences, spotlighting at night, all that kind of stuff. But you were making great efforts to actually truly hunt these deer on these properties. Talk about that a little bit and where that began, I guess. I know you started in the late 70s, you said, but when did you first experience, this type of hunting, like these big deer running into you, rattling in and everything?
Well, there's not a more fair chase hunt than a walk-in hunter. You're out there, you're in his territory, you're matching wits with him. That's all it's about. There's no baiting. There's no drawing them in, through their appetite. You're just in the role of Mother Nature and the breeding cycle and the rut. And there's no better, more fair chase hunting than that. Spot and stalk at times when you'd see one that was in an open 300-400 yards away, had to get close. You could get near enough, you thought he could hear the horns and beat the bone, and you just pull him. I've seen them at 300 and 400 yards and beat the horns and watch them run all the way in. I rattled a buck up from 500 yards in, watching him. He came every 100 yards, popped the horns again. He'd come another 100 yards. They just will not refuse to come see the fight. If you keep simulating a fight, they're going to keep coming until they get there. It's crazy.
In that
most people have never even dreamed of it.
Yeah. In that first stretch, those first few years, how many bucks would you say you rattled up?
The first season was novice in comparison. When I went 78 and 79, I became a hardened professional quick, almost overnight, because I just kept going deeper and deeper into more unhunted. Even the local outlaws weren't penetrating like I was, because I would go and spend the night. They wouldn't do that. They were day hunters. They'd walk in 3-4 miles deep, come out that night. I wouldn't even start hunting until I was somewhere between 8 and 10 miles deep, and further than that later in the career. The more I did it, the deeper I got and the longer I stayed. And I was hunting essentially just virgin territory that no man had ever rattled and hunted in. And it was insane what you could see, how many bucks and how big they were. It was heaven on earth. Like I say, I just completely got lost and hooked up in it. I couldn't resist it. There was a force every year that was going to, no one could keep me out of those woods every year, until I started going to church. I didn't think it was ever going to change, but something changed inside of me. And I didn't care for it like I used to, after the first 7 years. I lived a completely different life for 6 years and went through this bad divorce and went back to it and found my love for it again. And it was back on. It was just completely back on again. In fact, I went more on a rampage that last 9 years and killed nearly twice as many big deer during the 9 years that followed my temporary retirement, so it's a long story. That's what's taken me so long to get part 2 finished. Part 2's like 3 times the material of part 1.
Yeah.
There's a lot to tell.
What during all this time, what are you doing as a profession? Are you still doing taxidermy?
Yeah, I've got into my own taxidermy shop at 28 years old. And, once I did that, I had a shop for about 5.5, 6 years. And, that helped keep me occupied. I wasn't free to go back to South Texas. I was in Dallas-Fort Worth area again. I came back home. And I never thought I'd go back to poaching or ever even live down there again or go down there again. I thought it was over. And it ended up that I did go back.
Yeah.
It's a long story. There's a lot to tell about it.
So how long were you normally in the woods? Because you talk about being a walk-in hunter in these senses and everything, more than just, going out there for an evening or a day. How long would you typically spend in the woods?
I've like 10 or 12 day minimum hunts. I've got, I hit 7 days and I thought that was nothing. I started doing 10, 12 day hunts. Next thing you know, 16-day hunt. 27 days was my longest hunt ever. And I did not want to come out. I wanted to stay another week. In fact, one of the cops I took when I went back out of retirement, he was asked by a close friend of mine. He said, it's been 3 weeks. He said, I'm worried about Charlie. He said, you think we ought to call down there and check on him? He said, no, Larry, they'll give him a call if he's caught. He said, by now, Charlie's either dead or he's having the time of his life. And he was right. I was having the time of my life. I did not want to come out. I could have easily stayed another 2 weeks. I didn't want to come home. But I ran out all my carbohydrates and chewing tobacco and everything. I was out of everything. I had to come out. I'd already lost 26, 27 pounds,
Wow.
It was unbelievable.
So for treks in that are this lengthy in time, like you just talked about having to come out because you're running out of stuff, how much stuff are you bringing in with you, and what all is that?
I'd go over the fence with 130 to 40 pounds on my back, and I'd have a ton of instant coffee, little tea bags, Folgers instant single coffee. I think I took 100 one time, 100 coffees, At the latter part of it, I got into instant potatoes. I started eating like a king. I'd take instant potatoes with that squeezed parquet butter, margarine, and eat, stir up a batch of hot instant potatoes along with my deer meat or turkey or whatever I was having. We've made gravy out there, man. I took bacon in cans. I took everything I could think of for variety because you get tired of eating the same thing over and over. And I just, lived it up. Go buy a couple $100 worth of groceries. That lasts you 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
You eat off all that fresh meat out there.
You referenced some folks that you took with you. Were you taking other people out there on these walk-in hunts and everything? And what was that interaction like? Getting those people to, were you getting them hooked on the same, you referenced it as an addiction that you were as well?
Yeah, I completely ruined them. They knew they would never have fun hunting their leases again. They were spoiled rotten, The first cop I took, this was in the days of Bo. What was that Bo guy's last name? Jackson. Bo Jackson days.
Mm-hmm.
And after the first rattle and him seeing $3 come running in a coat, he said, Bo don't know shit. That was in the days of Bo knows baseball, Bo knows football, Bo knows tennis, in the commercial. But he said, Bo don't know shit. He, when he saw me rattling them deer in, he put me up on a pedestal. He said, man, I ain't going to be able to want to come out of here, and I'll never be happy hunting on my lease again. This is going to run me. And he was right. And the whole hunt, he kept saying, Bo don't know shit.
So
there's no life like that.
Yeah. So you talked about how you had several years in the late 70s into the 80s, and then you started going to church, you had kind of a life change, and then it was several years before you went back into it. At what point did you start gaining a reputation? Like obviously now you're famous for being the Prince of Poachers, but at what point did these landowners start catching on to, hey, this is the same guy that is always out here and we can't catch him?
Well, they were onto it pretty quick because you can't keep a big buck a secret. Anybody that started killing big bucks that wasn't an invite to the ranch, they knew they were taking them outlaw. I mean, you down there, you're considered guilty until proven innocent. If you're the guy that just killed the big buck, you must have poached him if you weren't someone they knew they had invited and taken. See, the word gets out. So if you killed a big one and it was being talked about, they automatically knew you'd outlawed it. And being competition for that lady taxidermist with a husband that was a game warden, they kept close eye on us. They were trying to run me right back out of town. They did not like having competition come to town on those birds. That was where she was making her money. And so they were out to try to get me the minute they figured out I was outlaw hunting at all. I mean, they were on it immediately. And then people in Fort Worth got jealous and started, telling them they'd seen the big deer and they knew I'd poached them down there, in that taxidermy I worked for in Fort Worth, that Alpine taxidermy. And so, you just can't keep big deer secret. It got out quick that I was outlawing them. So they were after me that first 7 years pretty much the whole time.
Wow. And what were those efforts like? Like, what kind of efforts did they put in as far as manpower, or what were they doing to try and catch you?
It was insane. There was a man there named Tom East that had the cattle grazing rights on the ranch. His grandmother, Sarita Kennedy East. And he looked at that like he owned the whole ranch. Well, if a shot was fired back there, he knew it was probably one of them giant monster bucks. And it just killed him because he didn't want anybody shooting them. They were his pets. And he put up 5 to 7 helicopters and pinned me down and run me out of the woods in certain areas. And I'd have to run 6, 7 miles to get out of the pressure sometimes. I mean, he was very aware that I was hunting, and he knew about it through Harry Riskin, the man that started me in that ranch, because he had a small section in there. And he'd see me and Harry going in and out of the El Pastel gate. So he knew we were going from Riskin's to the entire ranch, hunting in every direction. And so he couldn't defend against that unless he pinpointed a shot. So he'd have men out everywhere listening for a shot. And when they heard one, then they'd all call in the troops to that area and drag helicopters in there on trailers and light it up. I mean, he's pinned me down way more than once. I've ran wide open for miles more than once. That guy was crazier than I was about killing him. He was trying to stop me. He spent a fortune. He was rich. He could write a check for $200 million and it'd be good. Money was no object to that man. He dropped 20, 30,000 in one day to try to catch me. So I had a lot of heat. The old days when Tom was alive was tough. They'd get hair. I'll put it this way. I took 2 guys with me once and they split up. And they popped a couple shots. And then I got down on this big white deer all day. And they had moved off into the heavier big body of brush. The next day, they lit it up. They were looking for me after the shots I fired in that area. And the choppers combed it so bad. There were 7. They counted 7. I counted 7 got in the air that morning.
Wow.
And he looked at Dennis, this old man, Dwayne Kessner. He looked at Dennis Music and he said, Charlie was right. He said, I ain't never seen nothing so good that could turn to shit so fast. Them helicopters scared old Dwayne to death. He'd never been under that kind of pressure over hunting. He'd been a poacher his whole life, road hunting. He'd never seen that kind of pressure on an outlaw deer hunter. It freaked him out. But that's how serious it was.
So a situation,
and like I said, the fine was only $200 or $300.
Yeah.
But Tom was rich. He was after every outlaw he could figure out a way to get after.
So in a situation like that where there are such great efforts going to pin you down, how are you evading that?
That time I outran them. I got the jump on them. And once I got running and hit the big body of the live oak, they call it Puerto Mate. It's just like another 10 or 12 miles of solid live oak. And I was fit at the start of every season. I was in prime shape. And I mean, backpacking all, I ran, 4 miles without stopping when they were getting the birds up. When they had them helicopters all going up, I was hauling ass. And I didn't do anything but run. I didn't hunt those 4 or 5 miles. I just ran and got clear out of that area. And of course, about that time, they're all concentrating in that area. I knew I had them beat, and I started laughing. And we had a lot of fun back in the old days, too. The heat made it fun. I'd get disappointed sometimes if I went in there and didn't have no heat, It was part of the fun.
Yeah, all that adrenaline dump for sure.
Oh yeah, it was hilarious.
So what?
You get that far away from the pressure, you just start hunting again.
Yeah. So what kind of difference did you see in? Because you talked about the break, you talked about where things kind of changed in your life, and then you went back several years later to poaching. What kind of difference in the efforts either made by landowners or law enforcement? What difference did you see from when you were poaching before to when you went back to it?
Well, I gave it what I call the acid test. When we were heard popping shots on one particular hunt, me and a buddy of mine decided we better split up, give them two trails to try to pick up and follow, and at least one of us would have a better chance of getting away if they really got after us. But we ran back into each other along some sand dunes, and I said, look, I've heard a lot of trucks coming into the area. And he said, yeah, I have too. And I said, we probably ought to stick together and just move, get completely out of this area, move about 6 miles to the southwest. And he goes, all right, what do you think? So we did, and we heard a whole lot of vehicles, but we didn't hear any choppers get up that day. And I said, Tom East is dead now. That was the acid test. They didn't put no birds up. I said, it may be better hunting now than it was back in the old days.
Oh, wow.
Well, that wasn't true. Years later, they began to sell the hunts legal, and they began to manage the herd. They'd go in there in helicopters and kill out all the predators, kill out the herds of hogs. I heard they were shooting down the nilgai population, some from the air. And in one of those long hunts, my 27-day hunt, I fell under 3 days of helicopter assault. That was going on to the east. It was going on top of me. It was going on to the west of me. It was going on all around me the third day. That's a heck of a story. It's a long one. It's a hard story. I just told it on another podcast, part of it, some of it. But they were killing two birds with one stone. They'd heard me shoot while they were doing the cattle roundup, pressure me. Then they were working the predators all around where I had a camp. So I couldn't even hunt. I was pinned down the second day, then I pinned down all day the third day, madder than hell without water. And I went to a windmill after dark, and there was still one more helicopter that hadn't come in yet. After dark, flying with a big spotlight on. And he came and busted over the tree line, just a big explosion of noise and light. And I was out about 70 yards in an open flat with some flooded area around that windmill pipe. And I had to grab my rifle and just leave my pack and everything there and run to the live oaks and hide. And when I did, I had to dive in. Right as it just lit up, it turned to daylight in that live oak mud on me. I just dove in and rolled on my back and threw the scope up. I had the crosshairs on the bubble. I was thinking about shooting him down. I said, you stall on me and I'm going to shoot you down. I was at my breaking point. You know, it's like some Vietnam vet having a flashback. I thought they had me on a heat-seeking screen the way they turned and came right at me. So, see, I was figuring they were going to shoot me. They've been popping shots all day, 3 days in a row. Buckshot, double up, buck, just over and over all through the day. And them high-powered rifles off them high-rack gunners, I saw one of them, and they're shooting every coyote and hog they ran across openings with the helicopter down fence lines and out into roads. And so all the shooting had just unnerved me, man. I was in no condition to mess with then. I almost shot that helicopter down. Wow. I really believe if he'd have banked and came back at me, I would have downed him. I was that shook. I thought they were going to shoot me, so I was in fear for my life. So it got pretty hairy back in that latter 9 years, the last 9 years. It got tough. When I would go west up in the brush, there was some helicopter activity. I'd have to dive in some heavy brush, just crawl up in there and hold. I've had helicopters pin me down over there in Dimmitt County, Webb County. You know, it's tough over there too. You know, Red Nunley would put up birds and pin you down.
Yeah. So how broad was your range? Like, I know you speak a lot of like the King and Candy ranches and places like that, but how broad was your range? How far did you go in your hunting efforts?
Well, in the Kennedy County, I probably hunted at least half or more of the 400,000 acres. I'd be at one end of that ranch one day, and 3 or 4 days later, I'd be at the other end of it. I traveled like that on purpose. I wouldn't maintain any steady direction. I'd try big loops, and I'd go back and forth. And anytime I popped a shot, I'd be 3 or 4 miles away the next day. While they're looking for me over there, I'm off over here out of range hunting. And so that's how I got away with it so long, was covering that much ground. You know, when you cover that much ground, you get the odds in your favor. It takes them a long time to catch up with you. And unless they're getting on a good set of fresh tracks after a rain, that's what hurt me. That's what got me caught. They were on my tracks for 17 miles, but they had a lot of places where it was open, sand, wet, just making a perfect imprint of my tracks. And so they could call ahead, they get a direction and call ahead 2 or 3 miles, pick up my trail there. They'd all jump my truck and run 2 or 3 miles and gain ground on. I call that leapfrogging. And so that scattered country was a lot more dangerous than just the big brush. You know, I tried to stay in the big, heavy brush most of my life doing it. Most of those years I was in heavy brush. It wasn't that easy to track me. It'd slow them way down. You know, I'd bust a lot of heavy brush routinely and leave no tracks, and they'd get off my trail then. And if they ever picked it back up, you know, they had a hard time catching up with me. I covered too much ground.
Yeah. So how did you determine when you were going to go hunting? Was it simply just opportunity, or was there weather, or were there other factors involved to where you decided, yes, this is a good time to go out for a stretch?
Well, I knew the rut. I knew when it started. It started the last day or two of November, and it would run through December, and it'd get in a frenzy every time it rained and blew hard out of the north. They'd go nuts again and come to horns real good. I just got to where I like to hunt the whole month of December. And in the early days, I'd pick the weather and hunt 3-4 days. Then as I got into week and 10-day, 11-day hunt, I didn't care what the weather was. I was going in there till the weather came. I just go and wait on the weather. I like to go in ahead of the weather and leave no tracks on a dry, hard road and be back there and rest up a day or so in the heat. And then here come a cold front and I'm ready. I'm fresh. You know, just eat good and rest a little. And then when they start coming, it was like this. In the early rut, first week of December, it'd be tough on a hot day to rattle something up. But when a cold front hit, it could hit in the middle of the day, late afternoon. Within 1 hour of the cold wind blowing, they start coming to horns like crazy. I told a man that one time. He goes, "You think so?" And I said, "Yeah, in about 1 more hour, they're going to start coming to horns." And I mean, in exactly 1 hour, I rattled him up this big old 150-some inch 12-point, and he busted him. And he said, "You were right." I mean, then you just start seeing buck after buck on every rattle, you know, sometimes several. It got crazy, and that's the way it was. If you were in there when weather hit, you saw it. You saw it at its best. You got to see it all. You know, they'd run you.
Yeah. What, so how long altogether from the beginning to the end were you out there? Were you hunting? Were you poaching?
I hunted 17 seasons out of 22 years. Wow. I hunted 17 ruts. Yeah. I mean, one of my years doing that would have equaled most men's lifetime.
Yeah.
It was that good. I could see more deer in 1 year than most men ever see in a whole lifetime. So, that's how addictive it was, too, you know.
So I wanted to ask about that, too, because I mean, you talk about being a walk-in hunter and you know, rattling up all these deer and how the experience was the addictive part. But what went through your mind when you were determining if you were going to shoot a buck or not? Because it sounds like you rattled up hundreds of bucks that you never took a shot at. What distinguished a deer as far as it was shootable for you? It was one you wanted to take.
Yeah, I drew the line around 160, 65, depending on what character they had. You know, I certainly would have a hard time passing drop time bucks, but didn't see that many of them. I think I saw 4 or 5 different bucks with drop time, at least one drop time on one side or the other. And even when they were young, you know, you're tempted to shoot them. But my double drop I killed was a 5.5-year-old deer. Had he been another year or two older, he would have been a woolly mammoth. He just hadn't hit his prime yet, but nobody could have passed that deer. He was a 160 buck with double drops, 3 handlebars on one back tine, a 9-point frame. Beautiful, just so beautiful. I mean, he's in my book. He was so pretty, nobody would have passed that deer. You know, it didn't matter that he was 5.5. It was his last year. He was fixing to die, you know, but I've let deer go with a drop tine. I was coming out on the 16-day hunt, and I was walking the road to make time with a big, heavy pack full of shit. You know, it's heavy. I was tired. I was crippled. I had crippled one of my legs, And I was walking this road, and what looked like a 4.5-year-old deer with a big long drop on one side jumped out in the road and looked right at me at about 40 yards. And I just smiled, kept walking right at him, and pointed my finger at him, and I said, "Next time, big boy." I mean, anybody else would have stopped and tried to kill him. It was just enough to get to see him. I didn't really want to kill him. I probably should have shot him. He was that big, but with the drop time and all, I'd had enough on that hunt. I was wound down. I didn't care to kill him. So I let him go.
Yeah.
And just getting to see him was enough.
Yeah. So
there's so many beautiful deer in there. They're beautiful.
Yeah. What after 22 seasons altogether, you described it as 17 years of that you were hunting, 17 ruts. What are the events that led to your capture? Why were
I was set up. It was a setup. The whole thing was a setup, and I smelled it when I had already gotten the boat. Just as I was getting in the boat, I noticed this old man a few docks down staring at me uncontrollably. His eyes were bugging out of his head. He couldn't take his eyes off me. And I told this guy taking me, I said, "I didn't like the way that old man down there was staring at me. He knows something's up. He'd seen my backpack, my gun. I wasn't in camo yet. I was going to change into that when I got there and change into dry clothes. But the way he played it off, I got a lot of nosy neighbors around here. I don't pay no attention to them. I knew he was just trying to make me ignore it. Well, I knew there wasn't something wasn't right about it. I mean, I've said it this way before. He was looking at me like a scene in a movie I saw one time where these guys chasing these murderers, these two killers were shooting everybody in Vegas, I believe it was. And when they finally laid eyes on him, these feds that were chasing, he said, "Thank you, God." See, this guy's eyes were bugging out of his head like that guy in that movie. He'd never laid eyes on me, though he'd heard of me for 20 years. And when he saw me, he was totally just, his face was in awe. He was in shock. And I could see that from 70 yards away. Now, that's how bug-eyed his face was. And I knew then the way Liberty played it off, I go, he knows this is a setup, and he's trying to calm me down about it. And I said, what am I going to do? I'm going to do something different. I'm going to differentiate. I had told him talked to him about taking me to Black Bluff. Well, that's where a lot of the outlaws went. But as the more I thought about it, as we crossed the bay to the south about 3 miles, I said, Liberty's in on it. He set me up. And so I just immediately thought, I'm going to go to shore right now. They're all expecting me out there 3 or 4 miles away. I'm going to go to shore right now and slip on my Mickey. So I said, take me right now. Take me to the shore right now. Well, he didn't want to. Oh, man, you don't need to go yet. Let me take you to the better spot. I said, take me to the shore right now. See, he was still trying to put me out right in their lap. And that really set me off on it. I go, he's in on it. They're setting me up. So, I went to shore immediately, like within 3 or 4 miles of where they were set up. I was already in the woods, changed clothes and moving on. But they sent a truck and a plane down the beach. And even though I'd seen this big deer and was fixing to kill him, once they showed their ass showing him with the plane and the truck, I had to haul ass. I couldn't shoot that deer, and then spooked him when the plane came. And, it's all in part one. I put the final chapter on in part one for some sense of conclusion to the story there. But, it was a setup. You asked me how that happened. It was a setup from the get-go. In fact, the Tarrant County game warden up here that I know, he told me later, he said, that was a setup from the get-go. See, that guy cut the deal to get out of trouble. He was busted he tested positive for dope while he was on parole. They were going to send him back. He was desperate. He had to cut a deal with them to set me up to get out of more time in prison. It was a setup. Otherwise, they probably never would have caught me.
So, if they hadn't, would you have kept going?
No, I didn't know it was fixing to become a felony. But when it became a felony, had I not been caught, I would have threw in the towel. It was over. It never was worth going to prison for me. And I'd promised my parents, I said, I'll never go to prison over it. If it becomes a felony, I'll quit. I said, if I get caught, that's a prior. Jail time, second offense. I said, I'll get probation, I'll quit. I knew my limit. What was it Eastwood said? He said, every man's got to know his own limitations.
Yeah.
I knew my limitations. It wasn't worth going to prison. I'd already done so much of it, it didn't matter. I felt like after they caught me, like a guy they caught over in the Robert East once that had been on a 14-day hunt. He saw hundreds of deer. In 14 days, he rattled up hundreds of bucks. And when they caught him, he had a deer with 7.5-inch bases, a big old 14-inch drop tine on one side, and 27 or 8 points. A massive monster. He shot that one deer out of all them hundreds of bucks he saw. And he laughed at him. He was from Oklahoma. He laughed at him. He said, I had the hunt of a lifetime. He said, I rattled up hundreds of deer. I killed the dream buck of a lifetime. He said, it don't matter that you caught me. I don't care. He said, I just had the hunt of a lifetime. He laughed about it. You know, the whole time they took him in, he laughed. He said, this place was everything I heard it was.
Wow.
He was a pretty tough guy. And over there, you can't get water. So he had probably rationed his water supply, his liquids, for the 14 days. But he said when they caught him, one game warden fell on the ground. The game warden couldn't take one more step. When they lit him up and caught him, the game warden staggered backwards and fell on his butt. He was so weak from tracking him that far. They'd been on him with lanterns at night trying to catch up with the guy.
Wow.
I mean, that's how serious they take it over there west in the Robert East. They were serious about catching poachers.
Yeah.
They wouldn't get off your trail. It's like those Frank, Jesse, James, you know, being chased at night, you know, horseback with a lantern. They get on you over there. They stay on you 24/7 till they caught up with you. It's a horse of a different color over there.
Wow.
That's what made me develop those lock bottom boots, was knowing I was going into the big leagues. The Kennedy was small time on the risk of getting caught. The Robert East was a guaranteed you probably get caught. But when I thought up the mock bottom boots, that saved our ass. I would have been caught over there the one time I went had I not developed those mock bottom boots. That saved our ass. We were surrounded. I mean, it was ridiculous. There were men within 10 steps of us. I never went back. It wasn't worth that kind of pressure. You can't hunt in weather. You know, you can't hunt in weather like that. Men all around you.
Right.
Oh, boy.
So you talked about about how long you had been doing this and everything, and earlier on, you know, that they knew you were out there and everything. What about in the outlaw realm? Were there other outlaws trying to do the same thing that looked at you as competition, or were you pretty well respected as the legend of the area?
Yeah. Well, they admitted that I come down there from Fort Worth and outclassed them all, but they just did it for their own love and enjoyment too. They were just as caught up in it as I was. They didn't take it to the extremes. They grew up around it. You know, one man's ceiling's another man's throne. They've been around those big deer all their life. When I came down there, I was a greenhorn. I went crazy over it. And they saw that, and they got a big kick out of it, but they said, man, he loves it more than all of us. And that's why I did it like I did it. You know, I just went crazy over it. They did it too, but mostly from the road or shallow one-day hunts. They weren't willing to go out there and sleep in freezing rain. I knew what it took. My brother was a Marine, and he taught me some things, and I'd already gotten well adapted, stretching a lean-to with an 8x10 tarp, sleeping up under that during the rainy, sleety, cold fronts late season. I got tough as the weather. I paid a price to learn it. I got out there unprepared sometimes and froze my ass off, nearly froze to death. But then I knew I had to do this and that to counter it, and I got good at staying out there in that cold weather. And like I had one time, I had icicles hanging down off my toboggan, and I had a guy with me, and I stopped and looked at him, and I was kind of just like pointing out those icicles. I reached up and broke them off, just broke all them icicles off my toboggan. I said, what do you think? He goes, fuck. And I said, ain't nowhere I'd rather be. I just loved it that much. It didn't get too tough for me. The weather didn't get too tough for me. I stayed out there laughing about it. You know, he popped a couple of shots. He missed a buck and then shot the buck on the second shot. He said, what do you think about those shots? I said, what about them? He said, what do you mean, what about them? I said, there ain't nobody out here but us. Them ice front like that, back-to-back late January cold fronts, you know. I knew they wasn't going to have the window down in their pickup to hear a shot if they were out there. You know, that rough weather's when it's, you know, open season, you can pop all the shots you want then. And that's probably why the game warden came to my door about 2-3 years ago during that big snowstorm. They knew that was one of my strategies, was get out there when the weather was so tough, nobody on the ranch would be out there, no game wardens would be out there, I'd own it. So they thought, now's the time to see if he's still doing it. So they came to my door on February the 14th, I believe. I'd just been to my dad's funeral service the day before. And I answered the door, and there's a game warden and a deputy sheriff, mid-February. They thought I might be down in South Texas hunting. Parson Wildlife sent them out to check, see where I was. I said, boys, that was a long time ago. I don't do that anymore. But, you know, that was one of my strategies, was to make a late hunt and catch them hungry out in the clearing. But they still come to horns then. You can still rattle up bucks. If they hadn't, shed their antlers yet, they still come into the rattle. I'd rattle up as many bucks in February as any other month. George Moore used to go and rattle them up into mid-March at night. You know, he killed 3 bucks. Backstrap all 3 of them in this road one time, cut the head off the big one, took it, but he wrote in the dirt, 23-inch spread with 15 points, just to aggravate the game wardens. He said 2 were laying dead in one bar ditch and another one's laying dead in the other.
Oh, my.
Yeah, he did stuff just to aggravate them.
Wow. So what's the biggest deer, to your knowledge, that you've killed?
I've killed a 180. I brought 2 180s out of there.
Wow.
But, you know, I've got a crazy story coming in part 2 about one of them I can't release yet. You know,
Yeah.
It's part of the story I can't let out yet.
Gotcha.
But I'm going to be able to tell the whole story. One other man that was involved in it has passed away this year. So it's a good thing I waited this long to finish part 2. Now I get to tell the true story about the whole deal. Oh, and he'd want me to do that now. You know, the joke's on everybody else now. They can't do nothing to him for it, you know.
Yeah. So you just talked about how even recently you had a knock on the door from a game warden and a sheriff. Has that ever since? I think you said it was it 98 was when you got caught? Was that correct?
Yeah, I was caught February the 6th, 1998.
1998. So since 98, how have
caught me
they?
going on one of the late hunt.
Okay. So since 98, have you been? Have they been paying you regular visits?
No, I think they got the message. I've had a couple other instances. I was in Wise County hunting legal the year after I was caught. I got off my probation and I got my license and I went up to a friend of mine's property up there at Lake Bridgeport, Chico, Texas, Decatur. And I put my keypad on lock where I wouldn't make any noise and my phone wouldn't ring or nothing while I was in the stand. So they come and pick us up after dark and we get back to the house. And as soon as we get back to the house, my phone rings. Well, it couldn't have rang under the normal people calling me. It had to be law. I answered it, and this lady says, Wise County Sheriff's Department, what's your emergency? I said, I didn't have one. I didn't dial your number. My phone, my keyboard's on lock. I just got out of a deer stand. She goes, well, is everybody okay? And I said, look, lady, why did you call me? I didn't call 911. I knew it was fishy from the start. And she said, well, as long as everybody's okay, that's all that matters. Well, I talked to the justice of the peace up there about it. He said, you're right. They don't think you've quit. They pinged you on those towers up there through the sheriff's department. The game wardens had them ping you, checking on where you were. They knew you were in North Texas, and they were just trying to make sure you weren't in South Texas. And I jumped another game warden about it, and he goes, nobody thinks you've quit, Charlie. And I said, I know that. I said, I know it's true, and I don't believe it. It took them a few years to realize that I had quit.
Yeah.
It wasn't worth going to prison for.
Yeah.
You got to know when to fold them.
So after all the years, and I don't know if this is something that you want to share, but how many deer do you think you killed in that 22-year window?
I shot upwards of 60 of those 116 big ones.
Wow.
I killed 60 big whitetails. Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to have them all in one room at the same time. You know, I gave a lot of them to friends that just wanted a big deer mounted at their house. They didn't, want to go kill one another. I want you to mount one of those for me, and I'll pay you to mount it. I didn't sell my heads as much as I gave. I gave a number of them away.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've still got many heads at other people's places, but I turned in all the big ones at one point during my, 6 years of retirement going to church. You know, there's some more to that story too, but there's so much more coming. The story's so long. It's a lifetime story. You know, it's not just something that somebody did for a while. You know, it encompasses the entire 22 years and then some,
Right.
I mean, I could go back and write a book about my childhood, and it would be a book. That's how much, hunting I did as a 14 to 16, 17-year-old kid. We did some crazy shit back then.
Yeah.
You know, we wore the ducks, hawks, and owls. We wore it all out growing up with shotguns and 22s.
Yeah.
You know, me being a taxidermist, they were still picking up hawks and owl mounts all over Arlington 10 years after I, quit killing them. You know, at a point, I didn't want to ever kill any more birds of prey. It was illegal, but I just didn't want to do it anymore. I gained some respect for those birds. And the last time I shot one, I said, I'm never going to kill another one again. I just didn't want to kill them. They're too beautiful. They belong protected. But I mounted many of them. I guess I mounted over 100 hawks and owls in the Arlington area when I was 16, 17 years old.
Wow. So since 98, leading up into today, for example, what has been your reason and your drive to create part one of your story, to go on all these different shows and to be sharing your experiences and your story? What's been your driving force behind that?
Well, nobody's going to see it coming. I'm the last person they would expect it from. But I've got a testimony for God that's supernatural. It's going to shock everybody. They're not going to believe it's coming from me. From someone else, they might believe it, but they're not going to believe their eyes and ears when they hear it, see it coming out of me. I can't reveal any of it right now. You know, I've hinted around about some of it on previous podcasts, and you can go by that and, gain a little knowledge on it. But when I get down to detailing the whole story in part two, it's going to be a shocker. That's going to shock everybody. I mean, that deal right there is, what's going to make it into a movie. Maybe Joe Rogan will be doing me then, but I'm saying that is some big time stuff, and no one's going to be able to deny it. I think the reason God's allowed this to take so long to come all together is he's building a foundation where people will see my integrity about it. They'll believe what I say. I'm not going to be looked at as just some quack, had a bad trip on LSD or something. What I saw was real. What's happened to me in many more ways than one. My testimony's a full set of teeth. I've got something for the churchgoers. I've got something for them. They're not all right with God. They may think they are. Church attendance won't send you to heaven. That's nothing but a gas station. If you're doing the right thing, you'll be going by there to fill up your tank. But church attendance won't get you to heaven. You can't sweep your sin under the rug of church attendance.
Right.
Like a lot of people are counting on.
Right.
They're going to say, I went every day the doors were open. That ain't going to cut it for a lot of them. I'd say about 50% aren't right. And I've got some testimony that's going to make them get right. If they don't, I can't help them. It's too late for them.
Yeah.
And it'll be too late one day. So I'm just going to save that.
Well,
everybody's going to be shocked to hear it, though.
Well, I certainly look forward to it. I'll be one of the ones waiting to hear it for sure. But as we start getting close to our time today, I want to ask you, and maybe for all I know, this is a hard one to pick apart. But what is one of in your mind, your most craziest experiences you had while trying to evade capture?
One of my favorites, in the part one, I came to this store called the Buckhorn Saloon. It's a Buckhorn store, the gas station and all. And it had closed down at midnight, and I got there closer to 1:30. I got in this phone booth. They had a phone booth, an old-timey phone booth back then. And I made the call to my ride man to come get me, and I was smoking about a half a joint, aches and pains, and I sat down in that phone booth because as soon as I made the call, I saw a sheriff come from town, from Sarita, like he'd been aware of the fact that that phone had just been used. I thought they might have a bug on this phone. They know somebody just used it. And he ran pretty hard at me over there, and he circled the whole building. Well, when he came back around the front, I had ducked all the way down to the bottom in that phone booth, and the smoke had kind of, and my body breath and stuff, it probably, body temperature had fogged the glass because it was cold outside, and it was probably dirty. He didn't see me in there. He lit me up, but he didn't see me in there. Well, he pulls off. Well, I had stashed all my stuff about 300 yards up, right by another crossover, but just past it. And there was a long tree in this plowed field there, and I'd set my backpack and gun down there, and I had 3 heads. I had a 20-point buck I'd crippled up the year before that I'd recovered. I killed a 180 buck and a 162 or 3 buck, 14-point. And I had them all on the pack there. And when my ride man gets there, I told him to pick me up at the store, you know. So he did. He pulled right up, stopped. I came out from around the side of the building and jumped in where I couldn't be seen, you know, in the lights. And we pulled out of there. And when we did, a Border Patrol met me southbound. He turned around on that U-turn, the crossover that went to the store, and jumped right in behind us. About the time we hit the second crossover, he pulled us over right on top of my stuff. It was 30 yards, 30 steps or less from us. And they knew who I was immediately when they got my ID, and they could let one look at me, and I had about 3 weeks whiskers. It was an 11-day hunt, but I went in there with about a week of whiskers where I wouldn't get ingrown whiskers in my neck or nothing. And I smelled like a bear. Had been 85 to 95 for the whole time I'd been in there. I didn't have any weather. It was coming in that night. I was sick on the way out because the weather finally hit, and I had to come out. Well, they said, Mr. Beaty, step out of the car. I step out of the car. Mr. Yamona, you too. Open the trunk. These Border Patrol were licking their lips like 2 bloodthirsty cows.
Oh,
they
man.
thought they were fixing to find my backpack with big heads on it in the trunk. And Reggie opened the trunk, and it was empty. Border Patrolmen were looking around with their flashlights at a completely empty, spotless trunk. And their eyes were going back and forth. I was watching their faces because I knew it was going to be funny. And I looked at their eyes, and their eyes were darting back at each other like, we stopped them too soon. We should have laid off and waited and, seen what they were up to. We would have, if they'd have went on down instead of jumping on us like chicken on a gym bug like that, we would have stopped and loaded. And they could have turned around then and came after us, but they didn't lay off long enough for me to get my gear loaded. They would have had me. So we lapped all the way to Bishop. I got there and I said, go on to bed, Reggie. And this buddy of mine had just came down with another friend, and Reggie had taken them in that guy's truck, and he had the keys to this big old truck, old John Hopkins truck, Outlaw from Wise County. Him and Dennis Music went in. And so I said, just give me the keys to Hoppy's truck. I'll go back down there and get my stuff in a couple of hours. So I smoked the joint, killed time, paced a while, thinking, yeah, it's been long enough. I jumped in old Hopkins' big old truck. I drove down there and didn't go to the store. I just went to that 300 or 400 yards north, crossover north of it, did a turnaround, pulled up there, just threw it in park, ran out there 30 yards, grabbed my backpack and all them heads and guns, rattling horn, threw it over into the bed of the truck, jumped in and took off, laughed all the way to Bishop. I got to Reggie's house, and he got up and came in there. He goes, let me see them. I told him I had some big ones. He sat up there and smoked one with me, and we looked at them. And I said, man, I didn't have any heat at all. They'd done all way below there. What I figured they figured was that they thought my gear and all was below where they pulled us over. They didn't realize it was right there north of all the heat. It's hot from there south. The roadside park's about another 2 miles south of there. So they had gone down there and called out the game wardens, and they were all down there waiting for me to come back to get my gear south of where I had it. I had really slicked them by bringing it north of the heat zone. So that's how it happened. And the look on those 2 Border Patrol, if they were game wardens, it wouldn't have been any sweeter. I was laughing my ass. I couldn't keep from busting out laughing looking at them. Man, they just knew they had me, and they didn't have shit,
Wow.
That's as funny an episode as I've ever had and enjoyed, That's
Wow.
as good as it got being an outlaw right there.
Yeah. Wow. So, my last question for you, sir, before we conclude our time here today. Today in 2024, what is your stance on outlaws and poaching?
It's over. Anybody in their right mind is not going to risk a felony to kill a buck. It's not worth it. All these kids just need to chalk it up and be legal, because it's not worth losing your right to bear arms. It's not worth prison time. It's not worth it anymore. Those were the good old days. They're over. They're gone. You know, and the truth about it is stealing. And the game wardens are going to love hearing me say this, but, you know, one day I was listening to some Christian preaching on the radio in my taxidermy there in Fort Worth with old John White. He's the one that witnessed to me and got me to go to church. And so the pastor talking about it was, I think he was reading out of Romans 18, and he said, and you, he named the chief 6 sins of man, and one of them was stealing, and he said, and you, do you steal? And do you think that you shall escape the holy judgment of God? And I opened up my Bible, and I started looking it up, and I read it myself. And I walked in there, and I told John, I said, okay, John, this was less than a couple of years before I got caught. I said, I admit it. What I've been doing down there, poaching them deer, is stealing. I said, I see it right here. I just heard the man preach it, and it hit home. I said, I feel convicted of it. I said, it's stealing. And he looked at me and he said, Charlie, there just may be some hope for you yet. I knew it was stealing them, but it took a couple of more years in my arrest to bring it to an end. But it's stealing. You know, if you treat your neighbor as yourself, which all the law is fulfilled in that one commandment. He said, you love your neighbors yourself. If you love your neighbors yourself, you won't steal his deer. You won't poach. You won't steal anything from him. And so that's the message. That's one of the many messages I have in my testimony, is that poaching, stealing. It's like just what they call it. It's game thieving. And so, you know, I'm in agreement with that now. I didn't see it that way prior to that day. There's a lot of reasons I went back to poaching when I did, and would not have had those circumstances not taken place. But I carried out a vendetta sort of about it against the state for their involvement in my divorce. But the bottom line was, I already knew that it wasn't right. I had already quit doing it back when I first got saved and was going to church. But when what happened to me during the divorce took place, it put me back to it, and the cops got me to go and started it back. But I knew it was wrong for a number of years. But it really hit home that day when I was convicted that it is stealing. And I used to say what a man did in that ranch was between him and God, because they didn't sell hunts in the first 7 years. It was invitation only. And so I wasn't taking nothing from a fellow hunter that was paying to hunt and put up a feeder and built a food plot, put up his stand. I wasn't, you know, hunting somebody's lease. I had reasons I could justify it with. But the bottom line was, the day came when I was convicted that it was stealing. And I feel that way now. It's stealing. If I ever own a ranch, I'll probably find all my deer caped off and shot between the eyes on it. You know, you reap what you sow. But I'm not advertising. If I own a ranch, I'll say, look, I'll give you one cash and carry. If I catch you, I'll let you pay me for the deer and take it with you. But if you're back, then I got a file on you. But if I had a ranch with big bucks on it, it'd probably get the shit poached out of it, you know.
Yeah.
Probably big game wardens poaching it.
Oh, wow. Well, Mr. Charles, for our listeners over here at Fall Obsession Podcast, tell them where they can follow you, where they can find you, where they can find part 1 of your story. Tell us about all that.
Yeah, I've got a Prince of Poachers page on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, Charles Beaty 330. My website for the book is www.princeofpoachers.com. And part 1 is available. Part 2, I'm hoping to have it in the next 2 to 3 months. You know, it's going to be in that neighborhood, certainly around before summer. I'm going to have it this year. Part 2 will come out this year. I've just had some more setbacks with the cancer and stuff. You take a look at the left side of my nose. This skin cancer is still coming out of me in little patches everywhere. My scalp, like here on my nose, about 2.5 months now. I've been having a bunch of it erupt and leave out through that side of my nose. But it's whipped. it's being forced out now by my immune system. I've got the upper hand on it. It's just a matter of time before I get completely well.
That's
I've
good.
still got an area here that I'm working with, but my strength's coming back.
Good.
I'm gonna get it back. I may live another 25 years. Who knows? I think I'm too mean to die.
Well, Mr. Charles, thank you very much for coming on our podcast and on our show and joining us as a guest. I really appreciate you, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Maybe people get a kick out of some of the new stories I told on this one. Try to do that, tell some new stuff.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. For our Follow-Up Session podcast listeners, thank you all for tuning in. Be sure you follow and subscribe, whatever platform you're streaming on, and I will catch you guys next week for another episode. Thank you all.